Hi, I'm Matt McCormick from the Department of Philosophy at California State University, Sacramento. This is my lecture on Thomas Nagel's What's It Like to Be a Bat argument for my Philosophy of Mind course. So let's start with some questions. Let's think about first what other sorts of organisms have experience. There's a wide range of them on the side there, pictures to consider. And then to frame this discussion, let's think about what is their experience like. Do all of them have it? And then what's it like from the inside? And in what ways do they differ from us that will affect the character of their experience? And what other sorts of things do not have experience? So I've got a bacteria over there. I think most of us probably agree that doesn't have experience, but probably the rest of these creatures do, and I'll leave open the question about the alien in the bottom right. So now the question becomes, for a bacteria or something else, why doesn't it have experience? All right, so those questions help us frame out this topic for Nagel to figure out his argument against physicalism and how it fails to sort of satisfy a basic condition. All right, so on Nagel's behalf then, let's make a distinction between objective scientific facts and subjective phenomenal facts. I'm going to refer to those as third and first person facts, respectively. So normally we think of facts as concerning real, objective, public, intersubjective, autonomous states of affairs. So there's facts about what's going on in the world, and that lots of observers can access those and communicate about them and share information about them. So those are facts about public objects. Those are the scientific facts we usually think about when we talk about facts. These are things that different people can observe. We can jointly experience them. We can describe. We can test them. We can share our claims about the objects themselves. All right, so that's probably the more familiar sense of facts. But Nagel wants to get to another category that he thinks is being neglected, and he calls these first-person facts, or more famously, these have come to be known as what it's like to be facts. But Nagel argues there are also facts about what it's like to be a consciousness that observes the public world. So there are facts about what it's like to be an X, where X is an experiencing organism or something that has some kind of consciousness. And these facts have a special ontological and epistemological status that's different from third-person facts, so Nagel argues. Now, he's in a separate camp here. He's arguing against physicalism, reductionism, materialism, and it's a little unclear from the argument, from the article, where he ultimately comes down on our ability to access these, or whether or not even in principle they can be accounted for in a theory. But the question more generally here is about whether or not a theory of mind is going to completely give us a satisfactory account of everything that needs to be explained in a mind. So since these first-person facts are facts on Nagel's view, he thinks they need to be accounted for in any theory about what the world is, but first-person facts have this peculiar inaccessibility. So let's talk about access. How do you get to these first-person facts? Well, there's my first-person facts and there's yours. And Nagel's definition of consciousness here is this: an organism has conscious mental states if and only if there is something it is like to be that organism, something it is like for the organism. So the idea is that the creature has a perspective, or there's some state it is to be in there and to be them. So most immediately and most directly, there's me having my experience as a conscious being. And then we might ask, well, is it possible for some other being to get access to my conscious states or my conscious facts? Or, what kind of intersubjectivity could there be for us? And we might think about it this way with Nagel: being able to apprehend categories of first-person facts, like what's it like to be a human, or what's it like to be a bat, or someone else's first-person facts, will depend on how they are built, what sort of sensory system they have, the configuration of their cognitive system, and the character of the experiences they have as one of those systems. So if I'm enough like you in those ways, I can have some sense based on knowing what it's like to be me of what it's like to be you. But ultimately that's just going to be analogy, and it's just going to be a kind of indirect information or knowledge at best. I figure because you act and talk and behave like I do, and because you're built the way I am, because you've got a similar nervous system, a similar cognitive system, and you report, the same sorts of things about, some experience we're both jointly having. You have a bite of steak and I have a bite of steak, and we compare notes. And I make a extrapolation, a kind of argument by analogy that what it's like when you have that bite of steak is similar to what it's like when I have that bite of steak. Okay, so that gives us the basic distinction between first and third person facts, or scientific objective facts versus phenomenal subjective facts. And the question then becomes for Nagel, how do we characterize this category, and what's the potential here for us to get to them with a theory of mind? Okay, so to what extent is it possible to get into somebody else's head? So most immediately, first-person facts are accessible to the organism, a conscious organism itself, or by analogy, as I said, or inference to other organisms that have very similar cognitive and sensory composition. I can't really get inside your head to know what it's like to be you, but I can make a pretty good guess based on knowing what it is like to be me if you're built like me. But you can see where this is going, because the further away you are, the further away some creature is in the way they're constructed, the way their cognitive system operates, the less access or the less sort of familiarity I'm going to be able to have with what it's like to be them. And the argument by analogy is going to break down here. So that's the point of his account of bats. So Nagel's account here is that reductive theories ultimately miss the point. So a couple of quotes from Nagel. What it's like to be is not captured by any of the familiar, recently devised reductive analyses of the mental, for all of them are logically compatible with its absence. All right, so I'm going to come back to this idea in a minute. Right now, all I want to do is just focus on the fact that he thinks that reductive, materialist, physicalist, functionalist accounts don't capture the what it's like to be facts. And then we'll return to the logical compatibility stuff shortly, because that's going to figure in an objection that I'm going to describe against Nagel's position. All right, further, where it here is the what it's like to be, is not analyzable in terms of any explanatory system of functional states or intentional states, since these could be ascribed to robots or automata that behaved like people, though they experienced nothing. All right, so his idea is that you could have all the physical facts be the same, or you could have the functional states all be captured, say, in a robot system, but it wouldn't have any phenomenal or subjective state or experience at all. It wouldn't be conscious. And that turns out to be a damning problem for reductive accounts on Nagel's argument here. Okay, so how do we get there, or how far can we get from here? If an organism has a sensory and cognitive configuration that's far enough outside the range of my own, then the first-person perspective of what it's like to be them will not be available to me. And Nagel picks bats in particular because they're sort of halfway between something we do find familiar and something that would be utterly unfamiliar to us. Nevertheless, he feels confident that there are facts about what it's like to be them, those conscious organisms. So there are classes of facts that follows that are completely outside our capacity to apprehend, or maybe they're just at the limit of our capacity. And those classes of facts of what it's like to be some organism that has experience, but it has a very different cognitive and sensory configuration from you. So we are going to have a limited ability to get there. So physicalist theories are not even in the ballpark as Nagel sees it, because if physicalism is to be defended, the phenomenological features must themselves be given a physical account. But when we examine their subjective character, it seems that such a result is impossible. There's no way to render those facts, those feeling facts of having these experiences into any account of axons or dendrites or chemistry or neurochemistry or anything like that. It's a kind of gross mistaken approach. Every subjective phenomena is essentially connected with a single point of view. It only emerges or comes out of being that entity, being that subject that has the experience. So it seems inevitable that an objective physical theory will abandon that point of view. It just can't put us in the position of being that creature. All it can do is tell us about the third person external account of what's going on outside. So Nagel gives his famous bat case. Consider being a bat. So bats perceive primarily by sonar or echolocation. They detect reflections from objects within range using their own rapid, subtly modulated high-frequency shrieks. And one of the reasons Nagel's picking this example is because there's some things about their experience or lives that might be kind of familiar, but that's all quite bizarre from our perspective. We can't fathom operating that way. Their brains are designed to correlate the outgoing impulses of the subsequent echoes, and those enable bats to make precise discriminations of distance, size, shape, motion, and texture, comparable to vision, but it's fundamentally unlike anything we experience through vision. So it's a radically different kind of sensory configuration and cognitive setup, which is what's pushing the limit out here to sort of capture this idea of some of these facts we can't get to. So Nagel cautions us here when he says we're thinking about what it's like to be a bat. You don't want to make the mistake. He doesn't want you to make the mistake of thinking that you're picturing yourself flying, or as if you've got webbed wings on your arms. So your consciousness is existing in a bat body that thinks the things you think and has the beliefs and ideas that you think. That's not what he's trying to get at. That's not imagining what it's like to be a bat. That would require having a fundamentally bat consciousness, inhabiting an experience that's deeply unlike your own. So to really get to what he's pointing to, you've got to be the creature. Nothing, and he says, nothing in my present constitution enables me to imagine what the experiences of such a future stage of myself, thus metamorphosed, would be like. And his idea was, well, suppose that I imagine taking little steps from here to make my consciousness a little bit more bat-like, step by step by step. And from here, from where I stand, being built the way I'm built, I can't imagine what it would be like to be there, to be in that state of mind. I mean, in effect, I think what Nagel's suggesting here is that to really imagine being a bat is imagining not being me at all. It's to imagine that my consciousness is gone. I can't be there for this thing. So there's a kind of possible sort of fundamental inaccessibility about being there. To be there would be to annihilate the first person facts as I perceive them as my consciousness, so it's too far away. All right, so we're in the dark here about those kinds of facts. Nagel argues that attempting to reduce mental phenomena to its physical constituents is a kind of category mistake, and this is another jab at this physicalist, reductionist, or materialist account that he's been attacking. We have at present no conception of what an explanation of the physical nature of a mental phenomena would be. Perhaps a new theoretical form can be developed for the purpose. Nagel sort of makes this comment in passing and then doesn't pursue it. It's really suggestive, but I confess I don't know what kind of weird subjective science of consciousness he might have in mind. But he's quite confident about this. But third-person physicalist scientific approaches just have the wrong approach. They don't even start with the right tools. Okay, so let me shift then to a slightly more technical way that he presents it and return back to this notion of logical possibility. And now, having sort of motivated the position and kind of given it the best, most charitable account we can, I want to set this up for a rather technical but well-known and well-described problem that people think is in Nagel's argument. This takes a few slides and a few minutes to unfold. All right, so notice and I quoted this passage before. Here's one of the really central claims that Nagel makes. What it's like, he's been arguing, is not captured by any of the familiar, recently devised reductive analyses of the mental, for all of them are logically compatible with its absence. Okay, so the idea here is you could give a reductive analysis of the mental or a physicalist account, but that would be logically compatible with the absence of mental states, right? And that, he takes it to be a sort of damning criticism. Let me see if I can explain that some more. It is not analyzable in terms of any explanatory system of functional states or intentional states, since these could be ascribed to robots or automata that behaved like people, though they experienced nothing. So that's a case where you've got, at least functional facts all being the same. You can imagine a robot whose systems functionally duplicate what the cognitive systems in humans do, but they wouldn't have any phenomenal or subjective states. Now, Nagel hasn't used the term imagine here, but he's sort of taking it that we can see that we can separate those two in our heads, and that's going to be really crucial here to the objection I want to outline. Okay, so furthermore, in that passage he says, I deny only that this kind of thing, where kind of thing is the physicalist account, exhaust their analysis, and that's the analysis of the mental. Any reductionist program has to be based on an analysis of what is to be reduced. If the analysis leaves something out, the problem will be falsely posed. Okay, so that's his criticism against reductionism. All right, so let's say a few words about what logical entailment means and this notion of logical possibility and being able to separate these ideas. So here's a really simple example of logical entailment, one you'll know from lots of your classes. So famous old argument, Socrates is a human, all humans are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal. Okay, so on a strict old school classic account of logical entailment, 1 and 2 logically entail 3. That is, if 1 and 2 are true, then 3 cannot fail to be true. 3 is logically necessary as a result of 1 and 2. So that's what we mean when we say that one set of facts entails another fact or some other state of affairs. Okay, so by contrast, consider the sentence, Matt McCormick is 6 foot 2 inches tall. That's not a logically necessary claim. It could have been false. It's a contingent or a dependent claim. So there's no logical contradiction in the suggestion that McCormick is 6'1" or 5'7" or whatever. However, you couldn't have 1 and 2 in my example be true and 3 fail to be true. So there's a kind of logical requirement or entailment there. Okay, so Nagel's claim then is that subjective conscious states are not logically necessitated by the physical states of the creature's systems. Therefore, physical accounts don't explain consciousness. That's like, in a nutshell, this objection that he keeps circling around in the article. Okay, so what's that mean? A way of understanding it is that the form of his argument is something like this. He seems to be saying that given a reductive explanation E, like the physicalists want to do, of some phenomena P, which here we're talking about mental states, if it is logically possible for E to obtain or be true and P to not occur, or for P to occur and E to not be true, then E does not explain P. That's technical, but it's harkening back to my example from the previous slide. The idea was that, look, if 1 and 2 are true, then 3 has to be true. There's no way to separate those logically. And he seems to be suggesting here that for reductive explanations, if you can separate them logically, the two of them, then the reductive explanation E doesn't explain P. And it's logically possible for reductive explanations of mind to obtain and mental phenomena not occur. That's his robot point. And it's logically possible for mental phenomena of consciousness to occur without reductive explanations of mind. That is, he thinks that E and P can be logically separated here. Therefore, reductive accounts of mental phenomena fail to explain, or they don't give us the full account of what we want to account for. Okay, so now I'm kind of set up to be able to describe this problem or this objection. What I want to ask here to set this up is to say, well, in general, do physical explanations logically necessitate their effects? And what I want to suggest is that Nagel set the bar really high here. And if we start thinking about other physical explanations that do succeed in their explanation, we can see that he's demanding too much of a physical explanation and thereby rejecting it sort of prematurely. Okay, so here's the idea. In general, material explanations do not have the force of logical necessity behind them, but that's not necessarily a liability. That is, take all of our physical explanations of all phenomena, ones that we do accept, like for heat, chemistry, physics, biology. In all of those cases, it's logically possible that, say, I add an acid to a base and it doesn't blow up. Or it's logically possible that E does not equal mc squared. But that failing, it doesn't follow that acids mixed with bases do not explode or that E does not equal mc squared. Okay, so those are two examples of physical explanations where it's also true that you can separate logically the antecedent with the consequent, but we don't thereby reject those physical explanations of those phenomena simply on those grounds. Let me see if I can make another circle at it. Here's what I'm getting at. So take a handful of physical laws, like E equals mc squared, or the universal law of gravitation, which is there on the right. The instantiation of that on the Earth is that G equals 9.8 meters per second squared. That is, so you take the big F equals G times the mass 1 times mass 2 over the radius 2, universal law of gravitation. If you plug in the values for your mass and the Earth's mass, you'll get about that result. 9.8 meters per second squared is the acceleration of bodies at the surface of the Earth. Another example, ideal gas law, the pressure times the volume equals a constant times the temperature. So they're all related by that law. And the idea here is, my response that I'm trying to pose to Nagel is that it's logically possible that the speed of light is 100 miles an hour, for example, or that G equals 1 meter per second squared on the surface of the Earth, or that PV equals nRT plus 3, or whatever. You can make up any other sorts of examples here. That is, we can imagine them not being true without contradiction. Logical impossibilities, by contrast, are inconceivable. Try to conceive of a married bachelor, for example. And the reason I've got Superman up there in the corner is that the Superman case is an instance where we readily imagine an unaided human body flying. It's violating the laws of physics, but there's nothing logically contradictory about that. That Superman's flying is not logically contradictory the way a married bachelor is logically contradictory. So what I'm trying to set up here is that there's a difference between the way physical explanations work and the way logical necessity works. And it seems like what Nagel's demanding is that physical explanations have to logically necessitate their outputs or their results. So by Nagel's argument then, if we can conceive of those things, then it therefore follows that E does not equal mc squared, or that G does not equal 9.8 meters per second, or that the ideal gas law doesn't equal nRT, or that there's some failing in those physical theories. And the question that should be coming up now is, what kind of necessity should we be considering here in Nagel's argument? So there's a couple different kinds of necessity, and this is going to be technical, but I think it should be clear. And what's going to happen is that on both of these accounts of necessity, it looks like Nagel's argument fails. So I'm going to try to sort of pin him on the horns of this dilemma. Okay, so more formally speaking, a logical necessity, the kind I've been talking about, is any proposition whose opposite implies a logical contradiction. So it's a logically necessary proposition if denying it produces a logical contradiction. That is, it could not be false. So we know then, as a logical necessity, that all bachelors are unmarried. Were I to assert that a bachelor's married, I've said something contradictory. We know that squares all have 4 sides. If I was to say something different, that a square has 3 sides, I'd be saying something logically contradictory. So those are logical necessities. So a logical possibility is any state of affairs that's not logically contradictory. Like my Superman flying example is logically possible. Nagel seems to be complaining that physical explanations don't logically necessitate that a physical system will have consciousness. And it seems to be because we can imagine all of the physical facts being the same, but subjective consciousness is not present. And that seems to be the bulk of how he's sort of separating those two. But my point here is that no physical explanation logically necessitates its outcome. If it did, if scientific discovery was just a matter of logical inference, and we'd never have to leave the lab and look at the world, we'd just simply infer all the logical implications like we did with the mortal Socrates example. You could just sit down on paper, write out your initial propositions, and then just do logic and get all the facts. But we have to go out in the world and look and discover and put things together, and we find out that there's regularities in the world that are not entailed simply by a small set or some set of logical atomic basics or axioms. Okay, so are there other kinds of necessity that Nagel might have in mind here? Let me explain the difference or the notions of natural possibility and necessity. All right, so here's a weaker sense of necessity that Nagel might have in mind. The laws of nature, like the universal law of gravitation that we've already considered, those frame out and determine what's naturally possible. So it's not naturally possible for an unaided human body to fly. The musculature, the bone structure, and other physiological traits prevent it. So if you just take a regular human body under ordinary circumstances, they can't fly. However, it is logically possible. There's no contradiction in that's happening. And that's what makes it possible for us to imagine Superman or us to have all kinds of interesting science fiction scenarios, things that we can picture, but they wouldn't naturally happen in the actual world. But it is naturally possible, for example, we think, to cure cancer. So we don't have that cure in hand yet, but we think it's out there. And we're working on constructing a cure. Okay, so the laws of nature, which are different from the laws of logic, could have been different without logical contradiction, which is what I've been suggesting with my examples of different laws of nature in the previous slides. The periodic table could have been different. Gravity could attract at a different rate, or force could be equal to something different than mass times acceleration, and so on. If one of these different sets of natural laws were in place, then the range of events that are naturally possible would be different. Okay, so we could be in a different world with different natural laws, and that would have a different framed out set of naturally possible facts. But there's multiply different possible worlds here with different natural laws in them. So the range of the logically possible is really big. The range of naturally possible on our world or in our universe is narrower. Okay, so maybe Nagel means something like this. And what we need here is a notion of nomological necessity. And this is in contrast to the earlier idea of logical necessity I was talking about. So nomological is slightly weaker, and it means that given the laws of nature, given that we've stipulated a certain set of natural regularities, then X cannot fail to happen. So the cannot fail to happen here is weaker than logical necessity. So we all know good and well that if you step off a 10-story building, you'll fall to the ground. And we might even say that it's necessary, or that it's certain, or it's inevitable it's going to happen. And we also know that if you mix an acid with a base, you'll create a severe exothermic reaction. You'll have an explosion. That can't fail to happen. But the can't fail to happen here is slightly weaker than the logical necessity connection. The connection between mixing an acid with a base and an explosion is not as not logically tight the way the connection between unmarried and bachelor are, if you see what I'm getting at. So nomological necessity is a weaker sense. So if the laws of logic don't necessitate these events, Floating off a building creates no logical contradiction, but the laws of nature do necessitate them in the weaker sense of necessary. So we might say that those things are nomologically necessary. So maybe Nagel means that. Maybe Nagel is saying consciousness is not nomologically necessary given the physical facts. Or maybe he means that if you get a full physical reductive account in place about what makes up the mind or what makes up the brain, that wouldn't nomologically necessitate that it has consciousness emerge from it. So now the suggestion is, given that our laws of nature are what they are, and given all the facts about your cognitive neuro system, Nagel might be suggesting on this weaker sense that you could have all of those be true and yet there not be any subjective, phenomenal, internal, first-personal facts going on in there. Nothing, it's like to be you, or nothing, there's no lights on the inside. So circling again back to what he said about this, Nagel says reductive analyses are logically compatible with the absence of mental properties. And that's the sentence that we're trying to understand and see how this works against physicalism. So what does he mean by that? In what sense does he mean it's logically compatible? I've suggested it might be one of these two ways. It might be it is logically possible that physics and chemistry could be what they are in your body, but you don't have any mental states. That's the robot point. Or it might be nomologically possible. It doesn't generate a violation of the laws of nature for physics and chemistry to be what they are in your body, but you don't have mental states. Okay, so now we got the two senses. Let's see if we can figure out what he means here. Maybe when he says it's logically possible that physics and chemistry could be what they are in your body, but you don't have mental states. The first response here, I think, the right thing to say is, well, look, it's trivially true of all physical explanations that we give that their opposites are logically possible. Nobody giving a physical explanation says that the alternative is logically impossible. They just say, look, the natural laws produce this outcome. Scientists are not logicians. If this is a problem for physicalist theories of mind, that they don't logically necessitate their results, then it's a sweeping problem for all of science. That means we've got to reject everything. Nagel would be rejecting physicalism only at the cost of rejecting all scientific explanations. So it's way worse than throwing out the baby with the bathwater here. Nagel said, well, look, your physicalist account of the mind doesn't explain, it doesn't logically necessitate these outcomes. And then we zoom out and we look at all of biology, we look at all of physics, we look at all of the social sciences, we look at every scientific explanation we've ever given of anything, including all the ones we think are true, the ones that we think are best justified. And on Nagel's argument, none of those explain the phenomena they're claiming to explain, because they don't logically necessitate their outcomes. The best they ever did was maybe give a nomological necessity. Okay, so maybe he means in the weaker sense that the laws of nature could be exactly what they are, but the mental facts or contents could be different. Now, keep in mind that we're still 100 years or so into a sort of robust modern neuroscience. We're still in the relatively early stages of understanding how neurobiology works, how brain chemistry works, and how the brain is built and what it does, how it does what it does. So nobody's claiming that we've already done it, that we've already given a fully, a complete physical reduction of what the mental is. The debate that Nagel's engaged in here in the late 20th century is over the prospects of whether or not, in principle, some physical account could, at the some later stage in neuroscience or later stage in neuropsychology or something, whether or not, in principle, that could explain consciousness. And so that's what Nagel and some of his critics are arguing about at this stage. So maybe Nagel is suggesting, when he critiques these recent reductive accounts, maybe he's saying, well, the laws of nature could be exactly what they are, but the mental facts and contents could be different. But now I think we've got to ask, well, why does he think that that could be true? Why does he think that that could even happen in this nomological sense? First question is, Have we ever seen a case where that has happened? Do we know of any instances where the laws of nature were all in place and yet the mental states were radically different? We don't, and as far as I know, we don't have any examples like that. We don't know of anything of that sort. And also, isn't this the very question that's at issue? We're wondering whether or not a physical account can explain consciousness. It seems like Nagel can't prejudge the account before we've even got one in place. He's begging the question here, if that's what's going on. That is, it looks like Nagel's just assuming that which is to be proved. And let me see if I can sort of tease out the problem in more detail. Does Nagel think that because he can imagine all the physical facts being the same, but mental states being different, therefore it's nomologically possible to separate them? Now, before we understood how that was logically possible, but now is he suggesting that it's nomologically possible to have one without the other? And I don't follow here. When does being able to imagine X entail that it's naturally impossible or naturally possible? How does being able to picture it entail that it's got to be naturally possible? I can imagine going faster than the speed of light. We do it all the time when we watch a Star Trek episode. I can imagine the force of gravity being 1/10 as strong for masses. I can imagine magic spells. All of that stuff are cases. I mean, every time I picture a Harry Potter scene where Harry Potter casts a spell, we're imagining physics and the natural laws all being in place, but then some contra-physical or something quasi-miraculous has happened, some violation of the laws of nature have happened. And we imagine that all readily. We don't think in that kind of case that because I can imagine magical spells happening or natural law being violated that way, that therefore the natural or physical explanations of things don't explain. We don't undermine it in that kind of case. None of those examples are naturally possible, but I can imagine them. So the question is, where is Nagel getting this assertion that we can separate, or how does he know that you can have one without the other? That's the very thing that's at issue, and he seems to have just assumed it. Furthermore, there's some things I can't imagine, like this phenomena of blind sight, which is people who are cortically blind. Let's see if I can get this right. It's people who report at the conscious or phenomenal level being blind. They will insist to you, and they feel at the conscious level that they're unable to see. But then when you test them and you actually have them do some of these visual tasks, they will perform quite well at them. So it's a very bizarre and surprising neurological disorder. And I can't really imagine what it's like to be in that situation. But not only is that logically and nomologically possible, it's a real thing. So I'm trying to drive a wedge in here between the things that we can imagine, the things we can't imagine, and the things that are even nomologically possible, where Nagel's trying to use that against physicalism, and I'm trying to reject that as a legitimate objection. Okay, so let's then, hopefully I've explained the objection adequately. Let's circle back around to these alleged facts that started this whole thing, these what it's like to be facts that we started out with the bad example. Are they propositional? No, they're not propositional the way we think of propositions. They're not third-person sentences. They're not claims like the grass is green. Those facts are more about what it's like to inhabit a point of view or a perspective. I mean, I can describe my situation with propositions, but that doesn't capture, that makes it third person. It doesn't capture, what it's like to be in there, to be actually the subject. They aren't really knowledge how, which is another category in epistemology of kinds of knowledge, like how to ride a bike, although they might be related to that. So that's another category of facts that we're quite familiar with, but we can't really cash these out in those terms. They are facts about what it's like to be someone else, I guess, and there are facts about what it's like. So take, for example, having a tooth pulled is like a tugging, but it's way worse. I'm trying to describe as best I can the facts about what it is to be somebody else and the facts about what it's like to be me, and I'm trying to communicate that across the gap. There's some facts about what it is to be there, I guess. It seems true, but it's loose. I mean, you may notice now that I'm struggling trying to come up with ways to describe this so-called facts about what it is to be in there, to be that subject of the experience. It's not clear to me now, especially after this objection, that the alleged class of facts that Nagel is pointing to can be analyzed in any fashion, yet that handicap, on his view, is being held specifically against physicalism. All right, so he says that it's a fault with physicalism that it can't anchor these facts with logical necessity to chemistry, and it's a bit like saying, well, until a politician can solve or produce world peace, then they're a failure. It's like he set the bar super high for physicalism. It's got to do something that in principle apparently can't be done, and then he's therefore rejected physicalism. And this has all been prior to physicalism even producing the theory in question. Like, we're working on it, right? Oh, that can't be done at all. Can't be done even in principle. Okay, so let me see if I can summarize what we've got so far. We've got this basic distinction that physical reductionist accounts aim to explain all of the third-person facts about brains, on Nagel's view, and Nagel's been arguing that not all the facts about minds are third-person facts. Some of them are first-person facts. These are the facts about what it's like to be the subject whose conscious experience is the product of those physical processes. And Nagel has argued that physicalist accounts cannot capture the what it's like to be facts. Therefore, physicalist accounts are incomplete and they're going to fail. There's some aspects of reality that they can't possibly explain. Therefore, any adequate theory of mind must include more than just the physical facts. And then I've given you this objection that's become quite common in the literature, and a lot of people brought it up against Nagel, that Nagel's argument seems to be based on a mistake about what explanations do. Nagel wants physicalism to do what no theory or analysis can do. He wants the theory to actually put you there, to be the being itself. All right. Next, we'll consider some of the physicalist accounts like Dan Dennett's, and we'll get to see the dialogue back and forth between these two camps.